The morning Detective Marcus Webb received the DNA match notification. He was standing in the break room of the Chatham County Sheriff's Office, watching steam rise from his third cup of coffee. It was March 2024, and the fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune above his head. He'd been staring at the same water stain on the ceiling tile for 3 years now, a brown constellation that reminded him of a bird in flight, or maybe a hand reaching. He could never quite decide. His phone vibrated against the laminate counter. The screen showed a single line from the State Crime Lab. CODIS hit. Harris case. Call immediately. Marcus felt a stomach drop in that peculiar way it did when the past refused to stay buried. The Harris case. Ava Harris. He hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in almost 2 decades, though it lived in his mind like a ghost that had never learned to leave. He picked up the phone with hands that had forgotten how to be steady, stepped into the hallway where the morning light filtered through windows streaked with pollen, and made the call that would unravel everything a small community thought it knew about justice, memory, and the woman they'd spent 19 years trying to forget. The voice on the other end belonged to Dr. Patricia Chen, a forensic analyst he'd worked with on dozens of cases. Her tone carried none of its usual clinical detachment. "Marcus, you're going to want to sit down for this." "I'm already sitting," he lied, leaning against the wall where someone had taped a flyer for the county fair. A smiling child held a ribbon next to a prize-winning pig. "The epithelial cells we recovered from beneath the victim's fingernails, the ones preserved in the evidence locker all these years. We finally got a viable profile. It took 3 attempts with the new extraction method, but we got it. And Marcus, it's a match in the system." He closed his eyes. In his mind, he could still see the crime scene from August 2005, the walking trail behind Riverside Park, the way the morning sun had cut through the pine trees and golden shafts, illuminating what no one should ever have to see. Ava Harris, 23 years old, a kindergarten teacher beloved by every child in Millbrook, Georgia, found by a jogger at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday that had started like any other. "Who is it?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Patricia paused, and in that pause, he heard the weight of what was coming. Thomas Brennan, 56 years old, currently residing at 847 Magnolia Street in Millbrook. Marcus, he's been there the whole time. He's been living there since 1998. The flyer for the county fair blurred before Marcus's eyes. Thomas Brennan. The name landed in his consciousness like a stone thrown into still water, sending ripples in every direction. Thomas Brennan, who had served on the volunteer search party when Ava went missing that weekend in August. Thomas Brennan, who had brought coffee and sandwiches to the command center, who had walked the woods calling her name alongside 200 other community members. Thomas Brennan, whose wife Janet had taught Sunday school at First Baptist Church, who'd coached Little League Baseball for 15 years, whose hardware store on Main Street had a hand-painted sign that read, "Serving our neighbors since 1985. "Are we certain?" Marcus heard himself ask, though he already knew the answer. Patricia Chen didn't call with uncertainties. 19 markers. It's him, Marcus. The probability of a random match is 1 in several trillion. And there's more. We ran the profile against the national database. He's got a sealed juvenile record from Valdosta 1985, sexual assault. He was 17. It never went to trial. Wealthy family, good lawyers, victim recanted. The record was supposed to be expunged, but someone in the system made an error, and it stayed flagged. Marcus thought about the memorial bench that sat at the entrance to Riverside Park, bronze plaque gleaming in all seasons. "In loving memory of Ava Claire Harris, 1982-2005. She taught us to see the world with wonder." He thought about Ava's mother, Eleanor, who still lived in the same house on Sycamore Avenue, who had turned Ava's childhood bedroom into a shrine that she dusted every Sunday. He thought about Daniel Okoye, who had been Ava's fiancé, who had left Millbrook 3 months after her death and never returned, though he had heard through the grapevine that he'd become a victims' rights advocate in Atlanta, channeling his grief into something that resembled purpose. "I need to bring him in," Marcus said, straightening up from the wall. His reflection caught in the glass of a framed commendation, Sheriff's Deputy of the Year 2018, and he barely recognized the man looking back. Gray had crept into his temples, lines had deepened around his eyes. 19 years had passed since Ava Harris had been found on that trail, and he had spent every single one of them wondering if he'd missed something, if he'd failed her, if justice would ever find its way home. Marcus, there's a protocol. I know the protocol, Pat. I wrote half of it. But this is Millbrook, population 8,000. Everyone knows everyone. If word gets out before we move, he could run, or worse. Marcus was already walking toward his office, his mind shifting into the methodical precision that had defined his career. I'm getting a warrant. We move today. The hardware store would be opening in an hour. Thomas Brennan would be behind the counter like he was every Tuesday, helping customers select the right size of nails, recommending the best paint for kitchen cabinets, offering that easy smile that had made him a fixture of downtown commerce for almost 4 decades. Marcus hung up and stood in his office doorway, looking out at the bullpen where 3 other detectives were beginning their morning routines. Sarah Kimmons was reviewing case files, her reading glasses perched on her nose. Robert Bear Patterson was at his desk, phone pressed to his ear, probably calling his daughter at college like he did every Tuesday morning. Jennifer Cruz was making her way through a stack of witness statements, highlighter in hand, methodical as ever. They had no idea that in a few hours their small city would fracture along lines invisible and deep. Marcus picked up the phone again and dialed Judge William Harrington's chambers. The judge answered on the second ring, his voice gravelly from years of courtroom oration and too many cigars. "Webb, this better be good. I've got a docket that looks like a phone book." "Judge, I need a warrant. The Harris case." The silence that followed was profound. Judge Harrington had presided over Millbrook's courts for 32 years. He'd been the one who had declared Ava's case officially cold in 2010, when leads had dried up and resources had been redirected. He'd been at her funeral, had watched her casket lowered into the red Georgia clay while a choir sang Amazing Grace and the entire town wept. "You found something," the judge said finally. It wasn't a question. "DNA match. CODIS hit. It's airtight, Your Honor." "Who?" Marcus told him. In the pause that followed, he could almost hear the judge's world shifting, the same way his own had shifted 20 minutes ago. Thomas Brennan wasn't just a community member. His hardware store sponsored the high school baseball team. His wife Janet had organized the annual food drive for 15 years before her death from cancer in 2019. The Brennans had been interviewed during the initial investigation, naturally. Everyone who'd been at the park that weekend had been interviewed, but they'd been cleared quickly. Thomas's alibi corroborated by multiple witnesses who'd seen him at a Rotary Club breakfast on Sunday morning at the Waffle House on Main Street. Except, alibis only mattered if you knew when the murder had actually occurred, and the medical examiner's report had given them a window, sometime between 8 p.m. Saturday night and 4 a.m. Sunday morning. The Rotary Club breakfast had been Sunday at 9 a.m., hours after Ava was already gone. "I'll have the warrant ready in an hour," Judge Harrington said, his voice steady despite the tremor Marcus detected beneath. "Marcus, be sure, be absolutely sure, because once this starts, there's no putting it back in the box." "I'm sure, Your Honor." Marcus hung up and walked to the evidence room in the basement, a concrete space that smelled like dust and old cardboard and the accumulated weight of unsolved mysteries. The Harris case occupied box 2005 A019, sitting on a shelf between a domestic assault from June and a break-in from September. He pulled it down carefully, the cardboard soft with age, and carried it back to his office like a man carrying something sacred. Inside were the photographs he'd looked at 10,000 times. Ava on the trail, her yellow sundress torn, her dark hair fanned across the pine needles. The blood-stained rock that had been the weapon, granite worn smooth by the Savannah River, the silver necklace she'd been wearing, a delicate chain with a small compass pendant, a gift from Daniel, he'd later learned, because Ava had loved the idea of always finding her way home. The running shoes she had on, pink with white laces, barely scuffed. She'd only bought them a week before, had shown them excitedly to her fellow teachers in the break room at Millbrook Elementary, saying she was going to train for a 5K in the fall. There were witness statements from the initial investigation. Mrs. Rodriguez, who'd seen Ava leaving her apartment complex Saturday evening around 7:30, wearing that yellow sundress and carrying a water bottle. Trevor Singh, the night manager at the Gas and Go on Highway 80, who'd sold her a protein bar at 7:47 p.m. He remembered because they'd chatted about the heat wave. Margaret Thornton, who lived near the park entrance, who'd heard a woman scream around 10 p.m. but had assumed it was teenagers fooling around, a decision she'd spent 19 years regretting in therapy sessions and confession booths. And there, in the middle of the stack, was Thomas Brennan's witness statement, taken on August 9, 2005, 2 days after Ava's body was discovered. Marcus read it again, though he could recite it from memory. I was home Saturday evening with my wife Janet. We watched a movie, The Wedding Crashers. It had just come out. Went to bed around 11 o'clock. Sunday morning I was at the Rotary Club breakfast at the Waffle House on Main Street, 9 o'clock sharp. When I heard about Ava, I was devastated. Such a sweet girl. She'd come into the store just the week before buying supplies for her classroom. Wanted to paint a mural with her students. We gave her a discount. It's the least we could do for our teachers. The statement had been verified. Janet Brennan had confirmed the movie. Fellow Rotary Club members had confirmed the breakfast. The movie rental from Blockbuster had shown up on their account. Everything had checked out. Except, now Marcus understood, Thomas Brennan had been careful, methodical. He'd established his alibi for Sunday morning because he knew Sunday morning was when Ava would be found. He watched the movie with his wife, creating a witness to his presence, then waited until she was asleep. The Brennan house was on Magnolia Street, less than half a mile from Riverside Park. An easy walk in the dark, an easy walk back before dawn.
Marcus looked at the crime scene photos again. Ava's fingernails had been broken, torn down to the quick on her right hand. She'd fought. God, she'd fought. And in fighting, she'd scratched her attacker, had taken pieces of him with her beneath those nails. Evidence that had waited in an evidence locker for 19 years for technology to catch up with justice. His phone buzzed with a text from Judge Harrington. Warrant ready. Come get it. Marcus closed the evidence box and sat in his office chair, looking out the window at downtown Millbrook. The morning was bright and clear, the kind of day that made you believe in fresh starts. The dogwood trees lining Main Street were in full bloom, white and pink flowers creating canopies of color. People were walking to work, stopping at Grace's coffee shop for the regular orders, waving to neighbors, living their lives in the comfortable rhythm of a town that had healed its wounds and moved forward. In 2 hours, that comfort would shatter like glass. Marcus thought about Ava's mother, Eleanor, who would need to be told before the news broke. He thought about Daniel Okoye in Atlanta, who deserved to know that his fiancée's death would finally be answered. He thought about the students Ava had taught in that last year of her life, who would now be in their late 20s, some with children of their own, who would see this on the news and remember their kindergarten teacher who taught them their letters, who'd read them stories, who'd made them feel safe in the world. Most of all, he thought about Thomas Brennan, who had walked among them for 19 years as a pillar of the community, who had shaken hands at church, who had sold hammers and light bulbs and bags of fertilizer, who had lived a normal life, while Ava Harris remained 23 forever, frozen in memory, buried in the cemetery on the edge of town where the moss hung heavy from the oak trees. Detective Sarah Kimmons appeared in his doorway, coffee in hand, her expression curious. "Marcus, you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." He met her eyes, these eyes that had worked alongside him for 7 years, that had closed cases and found justice, and sometimes failed to find it. Sarah, get Bear and Jennifer. Conference room in 5 minutes, and close the door. She did, and Marcus stood there alone in his office, holding the evidence box, feeling the weight of what came next. Through the window, he could see the hardware store's sign down the street. Brennan's Hardware, serving our neighbors since 1985. The letters were hand-painted, cheerful red against white. Soon, someone would take that sign down. Soon, the store would close. Soon, a community would have to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the monster he'd actually been. Marcus gathered his team and told them. He watched the color drain from their faces. He showed them the DNA report, the old witness statements, the timeline that suddenly made horrible sense. They asked questions he'd already asked himself. They expressed the disbelief he'd already processed. And then, because they were professionals who'd sworn an oath, they moved forward. At 10:37 a.m., 5 officers entered Brennan's Hardware through the front door, bells chiming cheerfully above their heads. The store smelled like sawdust and paint thinner and motor oil. Thomas Brennan stood behind the counter, helping Mrs. Patterson select cabinet hinges for her kitchen renovation. He looked up when they entered, and for just a moment, a fraction of a second that Marcus would replay in his mind for years, something flickered across his face. Recognition. Fear. Resignation. Then it was gone, replaced by confusion. Officers? Is everything all right? Did something happen? Marcus stepped forward with warrant in hand and spoke the words that would end one chapter of Millbrook's history and begin another. Thomas Brennan, you are under arrest for the murder of Ava Claire Harris. To understand what Thomas Brennan had taken from the world, you had to understand Ava Harris when she was alive. Not as the frozen memorial on a park bench, not as the case file in a box, but as the woman who had walked through Millbrook, leaving trails of light in her wake. Ava had been born in Atlanta in June of 1982, during a summer thunderstorm that knocked out power across 3 counties. Her mother Eleanor used to tell her this was prophetic, that Ava had entered the world with electricity in her veins, a force of nature from the very first breath. Her father, James Harris, had been a philosophy professor at Georgia State University. A quiet man who taught his daughter to question everything and believe in the goodness of people anyway. He died when Ava was 16, a sudden heart attack that left Eleanor to raise their only child alone, navigating grief while trying to preserve joy. Ava had inherited her father's curiosity and her mother's resilience. At Millbrook Elementary, where she had taught kindergarten for 2 years before her death, she had been known for transforming her classroom into an ecosystem of wonder. She had brought in tadpoles so students could watch them become frogs. She had planted sunflower seeds in cups so children could measure growth week by week. She had taught them that mistakes were just experiments that taught you something new, that kindness was a superpower, that the world was big and strange and worth exploring. Her fellow teacher, Monica Reeves, who still worked at Millbrook Elementary 19 years later, remembered Ava with a clarity that time hadn't dimmed. On the day of Thomas Brennan's arrest, Monica sat in her 3rd grade classroom after the students had been dismissed, staring at a photograph she kept in her desk drawer. It showed Ava surrounded by kindergartners on the last day of school, May 2005, 3 months before she died. The kids wore paper crowns Ava had made for them. She was laughing, head thrown back, joy radiating from every pixel.
Past the businesses that would have been closing for the evening, Grace's Coffee Shop, Miller's Pharmacy, Brennan's Hardware. Past the elementary school where she'd return on Monday morning. Past First Baptist Church where she and Daniel attended services. Down to the park entrance on River Road, where the trail began its 3-mile loop through pine forest and sweet gum groves, following the curve of the Savannah River. She would have been wearing her pink running shoes, the ones she'd bought at the sporting goods store in the shopping center outside town. She would have had earbuds in, probably listening to the indie folk music she loved, Brandi Carlile, Iron and Wine, Sufjan Stevens. She would have been thinking about lesson plans for the upcoming school year, or wedding centerpieces, or what to make for dinner when she got home. Normal thoughts, safe thoughts, the thoughts of a woman who had every reason to believe she had a whole life ahead of her. The medical examiner's report, and Marcus had read it so many times he'd memorized the clinical language, estimated time of death between 10 p.m. and midnight. The cause was blunt force trauma to the head, 3 separate impacts, the last one fatal. There were defensive wounds on her forearms, bruising on her wrists consistent with being grabbed, torn clothing suggesting a struggle, and those fingernails, broken and bloody, with epithelial cells beneath them that had sat in an evidence locker for 19 years, waiting to tell their story. Daniel Okoye, Ava's fiancé, had been the one to report her missing. He'd called the police at 11:30 p.m. Saturday night when she hadn't returned from her run. She'd left at 7:15 p.m., had told him she'd be back by 9. When 10 o'clock came and went with no answer to his calls or texts, he'd driven to the park, had walked the trail with a flashlight, calling her name, had felt his stomach turn to ice when he'd found her water bottle lying in the dirt off the main path, cap unscrewed, contents spilled. The search had begun immediately. By midnight, there were 50 volunteers combing the woods. By 2 a.m., that number had doubled. Thomas Brennan had shown up around 3 a.m. with Janet, both of them in sweatpants and hiking boots, ready to help. Marcus remembered seeing them at the command center, Thomas handing out coffee from a large thermos, Janet coordinating search grids with the efficiency of someone used to organizing church events. "Anything we can do to help," Thomas had said, his face etched with concern. "Ava came into the store just last week. Such a sweet girl. Please put us wherever we're needed." They'd searched the north section of the park, the area farthest from where Ava's body would eventually be found. At 6:47 a.m., Margaret Chen, a regular jogger who lived near the park, discovered Ava lying just off the trail in a small clearing, partially hidden by palmetto fronds. Margaret's screams had carried through the morning air, had brought search teams running, had ended hope, and begun a different kind of vigil, the vigil for justice. Marcus had been one of the first responders to reach the scene. He'd been a detective for only 4 years at that point, still young enough to believe that every case could be solved, that evidence always told the story, that bad people got caught and good people found closure. Standing over Ava's body that morning, her yellow sundress bright against the dark earth, her eyes closed as if in sleep, her hand curled around that compass necklace, he'd made her a promise. "I will find who did this. I will not stop until I find who did this." 19 years later, driving back to the station after interviewing Monica, Marcus felt the weight of that promise settling into something that resembled fulfillment. Thomas Brennan was in custody. The DNA was irrefutable. The case was solved. But solving a case and healing a community were different things entirely. Eleanor Harris still lived in the house where Ava had grown up, a modest craftsman bungalow on Sycamore Avenue, with a front porch swing and azalea bushes that bloomed purple every spring. Marcus had called ahead, had asked if he could come by to speak with her in person. She'd said yes in a voice that carried 19 years of practiced composure, of learning to live with a grief that never quite left, but did eventually learn to make room for other things. She met him at the door, 74 years old now, her white hair pulled back in the same bun she'd worn at Ava's funeral. Her house smelled like lemon furniture polish and lavender sachets. Photographs covered every wall, Ava as a baby, as a child, as a teenager, as a young woman in her graduation gown from Georgia State University, as a teacher standing in front of her classroom. The progression stopped abruptly at age 23, a life photographed until it couldn't be anymore. "Detective Webb," Eleanor said, gesturing him inside. "Please sit. Can I get you some tea?" "No, ma'am, but thank you." Marcus sat on a sofa that faced a bookshelf filled with children's books, Ava's collection, he assumed, kept like everything else in this house as a museum to a life interrupted. "Mrs. Harris, I have news about Ava's case." He watched her face carefully, saw the hope and fear that had become permanent residence there. "You've found him," she said simply. Not a question, an understanding. "Yes, ma'am. We made an arrest this morning. DNA evidence from the crime scene, we got a match. It's conclusive. Eleanor's hands, which had been folded in her lap, began to shake. She pressed them together harder, knuckles whitening. Who? Thomas Brennan. He owns the hardware store on Main Street. The color drained from Eleanor's face so completely that Marcus half rose from his seat, afraid she might faint. But she remained upright, still, a statue carved from disbelief. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. Thomas Brennan. But he helped search for her. He brought us food during those first weeks. Janet, his wife, she organized meals for us, made sure we were eating. They came to the funeral, I know, ma'am. I'm so sorry. Eleanor stood abruptly and walked to the window, looking out at her front yard where a magnolia tree cast dappled shadows across the grass. He was at my house, she said, her voice hollow. 2 weeks after we buried Ava, Thomas Brennan came to this house with a casserole and a card. He sat right where you're sitting and told me how sorry he was, how Ava had brightened his day every time she came into his store, how Millbrook would never be the same without her. And I thanked him. I thanked him for his kindness. Marcus felt his chest tighten. This was the cruelty of it, the particular evil of what Brennan had done. Not just the murder itself, but the performance that followed. The way he'd inserted himself into the investigation, into the community's grief, had played the role of concerned neighbor while knowing exactly what he'd done, where he'd left her, how she'd fought. Mrs. Harris, Marcus said carefully. In cases like this, perpetrators often involve themselves in the aftermath. It's a way of maintaining control, of staying close to the investigation, of experiencing the impact of their actions. It's not uncommon. Uncommon, Eleanor repeated, still facing the window. What a word. As if any of this is common. As if there's a normal way to process that your daughter's murderer brought you a chicken casserole and you ate it while he sat in your living room. She turned back to face him, and Marcus saw something in her expression that he'd seen in other victims' families. Not just grief, but a kind of metaphysical vertigo, the feeling that reality had shifted beneath them and nothing could ever be solid again. I've spent 19 years imagining who killed my daughter, Eleanor said. I pictured a stranger, some drifter passing through town, or a troubled teenager who didn't mean for it to go so far, or even, God help me, someone Ava knew from Atlanta, from her college days, someone with a grudge or an obsession I didn't know about. But Thomas Brennan? The man who sold me the paint for Ava's bedroom when she was 12? Who gave me a discount on lumber when we built a deck? Who stood in the church and sang hymns with us every Sunday? Evil doesn't always look like we expect it to, Marcus said, knowing the words were inadequate but offering them anyway. Eleanor nodded slowly and returned to her seat. What happens now? He'll be arraigned. The DA will file formal charges, murder in first degree most likely. The evidence is strong. The DNA is irrefutable. He'll stand trial. And Janet? Eleanor asked. Did she know? Janet Brennan passed away in 2019. Cancer. As far as we can determine from the evidence, she had no knowledge of her husband's actions.
She died, never knowing she'd been married to a monster, Eleanor said softly. I don't know if that's a mercy or another cruelty. They sat in silence for a long moment, the afternoon light shifting through the windows, illuminating dust motes that danced and fell. Finally, Eleanor spoke again. You know what Ava said to me the last time I saw her? It was a Thursday evening. She'd stopped by after work to drop off some books she'd borrowed. We stood right there in the doorway. She pointed to the front entrance. She hugged me and said, I love you, Mom. I'll see you Sunday for lunch. So casual, like she'd have infinite Sundays ahead of her, like that wasn't the last thing she'd ever say to me. Marcus had no response to this. In 19 years of police work, he'd never found adequate words for the last conversation memories families carried. But you know what else she said? Eleanor continued, a small smile touching her lips. Just before she left, she turned back and said, By the way, I saw that the Brennans painted their hardware store. New sign and everything. Looks really nice. Thomas did it himself, Janet told me. She was always noticing things like that,
Little improvements people made. Small acts of pride in the community. That's the kind of person she was. She saw beauty in a fresh coat of paint on a hardware store. Marcus felt something twist in his chest. Ava had noticed Brennan's sign, had complimented his work, had probably smiled at him in the store, had probably said something kind about how good it looked, and he'd murdered her anyway. Mrs. Harris, I want you to know that we never stopped working this case. For 19 years, it stayed open. Every time new technology became available, we retested evidence. Every time we got a new lead, no matter how small, we followed it. Ava was never forgotten, not for one single day. Eleanor stood as well, wiping her eyes with a tissue she pulled from her sleeve. I know that, Detective. You've been a good man, faithful to your promise. I've always known that. She walked him to the door, then paused with her hand on the knob. Can I ask you something? Of course. Do you think he's suffered at all, these 19 years? Do you think there were nights he couldn't sleep? Mornings he looked in the mirror and hated what he saw? Or has he been fine? Just fine? Marcus thought about Thomas Brennan behind the counter at his hardware store, greeting customers, making small talk about the weather, living his life as if he hadn't beaten a young woman to death and left her in the woods. I don't know, Mrs. Harris. I honestly don't know. But he'll suffer now, I can promise you that. She nodded and opened the door. Bring her justice, Detective. That's all I've ever wanted. Just bring my daughter justice. Marcus drove from Eleanor's house to Millbrook Cemetery, where Ava was buried in the Harris family plot beneath an oak tree that had to be 300 years old. Her gravestone was simple. Her name, her dates, and a quote from her favorite children's book author, Maurice Sendak. There must be more to life than having everything. Someone, probably Eleanor, had left fresh flowers in the bronze vase at the base of the stone. Yellow roses, Ava's favorite. Marcus stood there for a long time, hands in his pockets, watching clouds move across the sky, and thinking about justice and time, and the way evil could hide in plain sight. His phone buzzed. A text from Sarah. Press conference set for 6 p.m. Media is everywhere. This is going to be massive. He texted back, on my way. But before he left, he said aloud to the gravestone, to Ava, to the memory of a young woman who'd wanted to teach children and marry her fiancé and run a 5K and plant sunflowers. We got him, Ava. 19 years, but we got him. The wind moved through the oak tree, rustling leaves that had been green when Ava died and had turned and fallen and grown green again 76 times since then. The world had kept turning. The town had kept living. But now, finally, there would be an answer. Marcus got back in his car and drove toward the station where reporters were already gathering, where his phone was filling with messages, where the machinery of justice was beginning to turn in the direction of Thomas Brennan. He thought about Daniel Okoye in Atlanta, who he'd called right after leaving Eleanor's house. Daniel had answered on the first ring, had listened in silence as Marcus delivered the news, and then had said in a voice thick with tears, "Thank you. Thank you for never giving up on her." He thought about the students Ava had taught, 27 kindergartners in the 2004-2005 school year who would now be adults, who would see this news and remember their teacher's kindness. He thought about Monica Reeves and the other teachers at Millbrook Elementary who had carried on Ava's legacy in their own classrooms, who had tried to maintain the warmth and wonder she'd brought to the school even after she was gone. And he thought about Thomas Brennan in a holding cell at the county jail, waiting for his arraignment, his comfortable life ending in the space of a single morning.
The press conference that evening was standing room only. Every major news outlet in Georgia sent reporters. CNN picked up the feed. The story had everything that made for national coverage. A beloved teacher, a cold case spanning nearly 2 decades, a pillar of the community revealed as a monster. Sheriff Linda Martinez stood at the podium, with Marcus and the district attorney, Raymond Cole, flanking her. Camera flashes created a strobe effect. Reporters shouted questions before anyone had spoken a word. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sheriff Martinez said, her voice cutting through the noise with the authority of someone who'd commanded respect for 30 years in law enforcement. At approximately 10:30 this morning, we arrested 56-year-old Thomas William Brennan of Millbrook, Georgia, in connection with the August 2005 murder of Ava Claire Harris. This arrest was made possible by advances in DNA technology that allowed us to develop a viable genetic profile from evidence preserved at the crime scene. That profile was entered into the CODIS database, where it matched Mr. Brennan's DNA with a probability of accuracy in the trillions to 1. The room erupted with questions. Martinez held up a hand. "I'll take questions momentarily, but first, I want to say this. For 19 years, Ava Harris's family has waited for answers. For 19 years, this community has lived with uncertainty and fear. For 19 years, our department has worked this case, following every lead, retesting evidence as technology improved, refusing to let Ava be forgotten. Today, we can tell her family, her friends, her students, and this community that justice is finally within reach. Mr. Brennan is being held without bond pending arraignment. The district attorney will be seeking charges of malice murder, felony murder, and aggravated assault. Now I'll take your questions." The questions came in a flood. How was the DNA evidence preserved? Why did it take 19 years? Was Brennan ever a suspect? Did he have a prior record? What was his relationship with the victim? Marcus fielded the technical questions about the investigation. D.A. Cole explained the legal process that would unfold. But it was a question from Jennifer Lawson of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution that cut to the heart of what Millbrook was feeling. "Sheriff, Thomas Brennan has lived in this community for decades. He's been a business owner, a volunteer, a churchgoer. People trusted him. How is Millbrook processing this betrayal?" Sheriff Martinez's expression softened slightly. "This community is in shock. When someone you've known for years, someone you've trusted, is revealed to have committed such a heinous act, it shakes the foundation of everything you believe about your ability to know your neighbors. We have counselors available at the community center for anyone who needs support. We have additional officers on patrol to ensure public safety and peace of mind. And we ask that everyone remember, Ava Harris is the victim here. Her family deserves our focus and our compassion as they navigate this difficult time." After the press conference, Marcus returned to his office to find it filled with messages. Former colleagues from across the state congratulating him on closing the case. Journalists requesting exclusive interviews. And, unexpectedly, a voicemail from Daniel Okoye. "Detective Webb, I'm driving down from Atlanta tomorrow. I need to see where you arrested him. I don't know what I need, but I'm coming. If you have time, I'd like to speak with you in person." Marcus called him back and they arranged to meet for lunch the following day at Grace's coffee shop on Main Street, a block from where Brennan's hardware sat dark and empty, yellow police tape across its door. That night, Marcus sat at his kitchen table in his small house on Pinehurst Drive, a bourbon in his hand, thinking about the day. His wife Karen had left him 8 years ago, unable to handle the emotional distance that police work created, the way cases followed him home and lived in his mind like permanent residents. His daughter Emily was in college in Athens, studying environmental science, calling once a week with updates about classes and friends and her growing understanding of climate change. He was proud of her, proud that she'd found purpose in trying to fix large-scale problems, even if he sometimes worried she'd inherited his tendency to carry the weight of the world. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional car passing on the street outside. Marcus thought about Ava Harris, about Eleanor's question. Had Thomas Brennan suffered? Had guilt eaten at him? Or had he simply lived his life, sold his nails and paint and lumber, gone to sleep each night unburdened by conscience? Marcus had interviewed enough psychopaths to know that some people truly felt no remorse, that their internal moral architecture was built differently, and that they could do monstrous things and continue functioning as if they were normal. He suspected Thomas Brennan was one of these. The way he'd inserted himself into the investigation, the way he'd comforted Eleanor, the way he'd maintained his business and his reputation, these weren't the actions of someone consumed by guilt. His phone rang. It was Bear Patterson,
calling from home. Marcus, you watching the news? No? Why? Turn on Channel 5. Marcus grabbed the remote and switched on the television. The local news was broadcasting live from downtown Millbrook, where a candlelight vigil had spontaneously organized in front of the memorial bench dedicated to Ava. Hundreds of people filled the small park, holding candles, holding photos of Ava, holding signs that read, "Justice for Ava," and "We never forgot." The reporter, a young woman Marcus didn't recognize, spoke into her microphone. What you're seeing here is a community coming together after nearly 2 decades of waiting for answers. Many of the people here knew Ava Aris personally. Others simply feel connected to her story, to the loss this town has carried for so long. Let's talk to some of those gathered here tonight.
She approached an older man holding a framed photograph. "Sir, can you tell us why you're here tonight?" "I'm Bill Martinez," the man said, his voice thick with emotion. "I was the principal at Millbrook Elementary when Ava taught here. She was the finest teacher I ever had the privilege of working with. Not because she was the most experienced, but because she had this gift of making every child feel valued, feel seen. When she died, it broke something in our school. Hell, it broke something in this whole town. We're here tonight because we want her to know, wherever she is, that we never stopped caring. We never stopped believing someone would answer for what was done to her." The reporter moved to a younger woman, maybe 30 years old. "And you?" "My name is Christina Wallace. I was in Miss Harris's kindergarten class, the last class she ever taught." Christina's voice cracked. "She taught me to read. She made me believe I was smart when I thought I was stupid. She gave me a love of learning that changed my whole life. I'm a teacher now because of her. 2nd grade, right here in Millbrook. And I try every day to be the kind of teacher she was. Patient, kind, creative. When I heard they'd arrested someone, I had to come here. I had to be part of honoring her memory." The camera panned across the crowd, and Marcus saw faces he recognized. Monica Reeves from the school, standing with a group of teachers. Margaret Chen, the woman who'd found Ava's body, tears streaming down her face. Members of First Baptist Church, business owners from Main Street, students and parents and neighbors and strangers, all gathered in the glow of candlelight, all holding vigil for a woman who'd been gone for 19 years but had never truly left. "This is what she meant to people," Bear said quietly over the phone. "This is why we couldn't let it go." "Yeah," Marcus said, his throat tight. "Yeah, it is." He hung up and sat watching the vigil, watching people take turns speaking at a makeshift microphone, sharing memories of Ava, expressing relief that someone had been arrested, asking for continued prayers for Eleanor. The local pastor from First Baptist, not the same one who'd presided over Ava's funeral, that man had retired years ago, led the crowd in singing Amazing Grace, the same hymn that had been sung at her burial. Marcus thought about tomorrow, when he'd meet with Daniel Okoye and have to relive the day Ava died through the eyes of the man who'd loved her. He thought about the trial that would come, the testimony that would be required, the way this case would consume the next year of his life. He thought about Thomas Brennan and his cell, and whether he was sleeping soundly or lying awake, and which possibility was more disturbing. But mostly he thought about Ava Harris at 23 putting on her pink running shoes, heading out for an evening jog, believing she lived in a town where she was safe, where people were good, where the future stretched ahead bright with possibility. She'd been wrong about that safety, wrong about Thomas Brennan's goodness. But she'd been right about so much else, right about the power of kindness, right about the importance of teaching children to see wonder, right about the value of community and connection. And in dying, she'd created a community that refused to forget her, that had held her memory like a sacred flame for 19 years, that had turned out tonight in the hundreds to say, "We remember. We never stopped remembering." Marcus finished his bourbon and went to bed, knowing tomorrow would bring more media requests,
more interviews, more procedural steps in the machinery of justice. But tonight, he allowed himself to feel something he hadn't let himself feel in 19 years. Satisfaction. Not happiness. There was nothing happy about any of this, but the deep, bone-level satisfaction of a promise kept. The arraignment took place 72 hours after Thomas Brennan's arrest, in a courtroom packed beyond capacity. Judge William Harrington presided, his face carved from granite, his 32 years on the bench evident in every measured movement. Security had been tripled. The bailiff screened everyone entering, confiscating anything that could be used as a weapon. Tempers were high. The community's shock had calcified into anger. Thomas Brennan entered the courtroom in an orange jumpsuit, his hands cuffed in front of him, 2 deputies flanking him on either side. He'd aged visibly in 3 days. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor. His shoulders slumped in a way they never had when he'd stood behind the hardware store counter. But his eyes, when they swept across the gallery, held something Marcus couldn't quite name. Not remorse, not quite defiance either. Perhaps it was resignation, or perhaps it was the look of a man whose mask had finally slipped and who no longer had the energy to maintain the fiction. The gallery erupted in murmurs when Brennan appeared. Someone shouted, "Murderer!" A bailiff immediately called for order. Judge Harrington's gavel cracked like thunder. "This courtroom will maintain decorum, or I will clear it entirely. Is that understood?" Silence fell, brittle and tense. The charges were read: malice murder, felony murder during the commission of aggravated assault, concealing the death of another. Each charge carried its own weight, its own potential sentence. Together, they formed a legal architecture that would, if the prosecution succeeded, ensure Thomas Brennan spent the rest of his natural life in prison. His attorney, Richard Caldwell, a defense lawyer from Savannah with a reputation for taking difficult cases, entered a plea of not guilty. This was expected. What wasn't expected was Caldwell's immediate motion for a change of venue. "Your Honor," Caldwell said, his voice smooth and practiced, "my client cannot receive a fair trial in Chatham County. The media coverage has been overwhelming. The community's emotional
Investment in this case is understandable but prejudicial. We respectfully request that this trial be moved to a jurisdiction where potential jurors haven't been saturated with 19 years of victim sympathy and 3 days of inflammatory news coverage." District Attorney Raymond Cole was on his feet immediately. "Your Honor, the state opposes this motion. The defendant lived in this community for 40 years. He built his reputation here, his business here, his life here. He doesn't get to hide from the consequences of his actions by claiming the people he deceived are too invested in seeing justice done." Judge Harrington listened to arguments from both sides, then took a 20-minute recess to consider. When he returned, his decision was unequivocal. Motion denied. This court has faith in the jury selection process to identify fair and impartial jurors. Trial will proceed in Chatham County. Jury selection will begin in 60 days. Mr. Brennan will remain in custody without bond. This court is adjourned. Outside the courthouse, the media circus intensified. News vans from Atlanta, Savannah, Augusta, and Columbia, South Carolina lined the street. Reporters thrust microphones at anyone willing to talk. Marcus emerged from a side entrance to avoid the worst of it, but was still cornered by Jennifer Lawson from the AJC. "Detective Webb, sources tell us the DNA evidence is irrefutable. Is there any possibility Thomas Brennan isn't guilty?" Marcus kept his expression neutral. "The evidence will be presented at trial. I'm confident in what we've found. There are rumors that Brennan had a sealed juvenile record involving sexual assault. Can you confirm this?" "I can't comment on sealed records." "How is Eleanor Harris handling the news?" "Mrs. Harris is processing this with the strength and dignity she's shown for 19 years. Please respect her privacy during this time." He extracted himself and headed to his car, where Daniel Okoye was waiting. They'd postponed their lunch meeting because of the arraignment, but Daniel had come anyway. driving down from Atlanta and sitting in the courthouse gallery, watching the man who'd murdered his fiancée stand before a judge. Daniel was 39 now, his hair beginning to gray at the temples, his face carrying the particular weathering that came from intimate acquaintance with grief. He worked for the Georgia Network to end sexual assault, advocating for victims' rights, helping families navigate the criminal justice system. Marcus had followed his career from a distance, had always wondered if Daniel had found any peace. "Thank you for being here," Daniel said as Marcus approached. "I know you didn't have to do this." "I wanted to," Marcus replied. "Can we go somewhere quieter, away from all this?" They drove to Riverside Park, to the trail where Ava had died. It had been closed for 3 days after her body was found, then reopened because the community had insisted on it. Insisted that Ava would have wanted people to continue enjoying the space she'd loved, that fear shouldn't win. The memorial bench sat at the trail's entrance, and Daniel walked to it slowly, running his fingers across the bronze plaque. "I haven't been back here since the funeral," Daniel said quietly. "I couldn't. Every time I thought about coming, I'd remember planning our wedding, talking about bringing our kids here someday, to teach them to skip stones in the river. And then I'd remember that those kids would never exist. That future was just gone." Marcus stood beside him, letting him talk. Sometimes that's what people needed, not answers or comfort, but simply a witness. "We met in college, Georgia State, sophomore year. She was studying education, I was pre-law. We had an American history class together, and she always sat in the front row, always asked the most thoughtful questions. I thought she was the smartest person I'd ever met. Took me 3 months to work up the courage to ask her to coffee." He smiled at the memory, and Marcus saw the young man Daniel had been. Hopeful, in love, believing the world was fundamentally good. She said yes immediately. Later, she told me she'd been waiting for me to ask, that she'd noticed me too, but was too shy to make the first move. We went to this terrible coffee shop near campus, it's closed now, and talked for 4 hours about everything. Our families, our dreams, what we wanted to do with our lives. She told me she wanted to teach kindergarten because that's when you can really shape a child's relationship with learning, when you can make them believe they're capable of anything. And I told her I wanted to be a prosecutor, put bad people away, protect the vulnerable. His voice broke on the last word. "I wanted to protect people, Marcus, and I couldn't protect her. I sent her out for a run, and she never came back, and I spent the next 19 years wondering if I'd kissed her properly when she left, if I'd told her I loved her, if she knew, if she really knew how much she meant to me." "She knew," Marcus said firmly. "Everyone who knew you both said the same thing. You were completely devoted to each other. She knew." Daniel nodded, wiping his eyes. "After she died, I couldn't stay here. This town, every street corner, every restaurant, every place we'd been together, it was all haunted. I moved to Atlanta, threw myself into work. Therapy helped some. Time helped more. Eventually, I met someone else, got married, had 2 kids. I'm happy, Marcus. I built a good life. But there's always been this hole, this unanswered question sitting in the center of everything. Who did this? Why? Did they suffer at all for what they took from us?" Thomas Brennan, that's who. As for why, I've been doing this long enough to know that sometimes there is no why that makes sense. Some people are broken in ways that make them dangerous. Some people hurt others because they can, because they want to, because something in their moral architecture never developed right. Did he know her? Had they talked? She'd been in his store. They'd had casual interactions, customer and business owner, nothing to suggest a personal relationship or conflict. As far as we can determine, she was a random target. Wrong place, wrong time, wrong person crossing his path when whatever was broken in him decided to act. Daniel's hands clenched into fists. He searched for her. I saw him at the command center. He brought coffee.
He looked me in the eye and told me he hoped we'd find her safe. How does someone do that? I don't know, Marcus admitted, but he'll face justice now. The DNA evidence is solid. He'll be convicted. He'll spend the rest of his life in prison. They walked the trail together, Daniel pointing out places he remembered. The bend where Ava liked to stop and watch for turtles in the river, the massive oak tree she'd taken photos of in every season, the clearing where they'd had a picnic 2 weeks before she died. The trail was beautiful in its way. Sunlight filtering through pine needles, birds calling to each other in the canopy above, the river running its eternal course alongside the path. But beauty meant nothing when you knew what had happened here. Every shadow could hide violence. Every peaceful spot could become a crime scene. That was what murder did. It poisoned not just lives, but places, turned sanctuaries into graveyards. "Can I ask you something?" Daniel said as they reached the spot where Ava's body had been found. Someone had left fresh flowers there, yellow roses in a glass vase. "When you found her, was she scared? Did she suffer?" Marcus had anticipated this question. 19 years, and no one had asked it directly. Not Eleanor, not the other teachers, not the reporters. But Daniel needed to know, deserved to know, even if the truth was hard. The medical examiner said the first blow probably disoriented her. The second knocked her unconscious. The third was what killed her. But she wouldn't have felt it. She would
Have been aware during the struggle, yes. She fought. Her defensive wounds show that. But the end came quickly, Daniel. She didn't suffer long. It was both truth and mercy, the kind of careful honesty that law enforcement learned to provide. Daniel nodded, tears streaming freely now. "Thank you for telling me, for not lying or softening it too much. I needed to know." They stood there together for a long moment, two men connected by their relationship to a woman who'd been gone for 19 years, but whose absence still shaped their lives in profound ways. "What happens now?" Daniel asked, finally. "Trial preparation. It'll take months. The defense will file motions, try to suppress evidence, challenge the DNA analysis. It's all standard procedure. But Cole is good. He'll hold the line. And when it goes to trial, likely early next year, we'll present the evidence. The jury will deliberate, and then there will be a verdict. Will you need me to testify? Probably not as a material witness, but the prosecution may call you to establish Ava's character, to show the jury who she was beyond just a victim in a case file. Would you be willing?" "Yes," Daniel said without hesitation. Anything to help put him away. They drove back to town, and Marcus dropped Daniel at his car in the courthouse parking lot. As he was getting out, he turned back. "Marcus, can I ask one more thing?" "Of course." "Do you think about her still? After all this time and all the other cases you've worked?" Marcus didn't hesitate. "Every day. Not every case stays with you like that, but Ava did. Maybe because she was so young. Maybe because the case went cold, and I felt like I had failed her. Maybe just because she seemed like the kind of person the world needed more of, and losing her felt particularly senseless. But yes, I think about her every day." Daniel nodded, satisfied, and closed the car door. Marcus watched him drive away, headed back to Atlanta, back to his wife and children, and the life he'd built from the ruins of his first great love. The media attention didn't fade over the following weeks. If anything, it intensified. National news programs picked up the story. Dateline NBC sent producers to Millbrook to begin filming a segment. True crime podcasters requested interviews. The story had everything. A cold case solved by DNA, a respected community member unmasked as a killer, the poignant detail of the victim being a beloved teacher.
But for the people of Millbrook, it wasn't a story. It was their life, their grief, their reckoning. The hardware store remained closed, its windows dark, the hand-painted sign looking suddenly sinister rather than charming. Someone threw a rock through the front window on the fourth night after the arrest. Someone else spray-painted "murderer" across the door. Police increased patrols, but the vandalism continued. The building became a site of collective rage, a physical target for emotions that had nowhere else to go. Thomas Brennan's house on Magnolia Street fared no better. Neighbors who'd waved to him for decades now crossed the street to avoid walking past his property. Someone left a pile of dead flowers on his front porch. The mailbox was knocked over 3 times. Eventually, the city posted a security guard to prevent more serious damage, not out of sympathy for Brennan, but to maintain order. At First Baptist Church, Reverend Michael Torres addressed the congregation the Sunday after the arraignment. The church was packed beyond its usual capacity. People needed guidance, needed someone to help them make sense of how evil could sit among them undetected for so long. "Brothers and sisters," Reverend Torres said from the pulpit, his voice carrying the weight of shared anguish, "we are hurting, we are angry, we are confused. How could Thomas Brennan sit in these pews? How could he sing our hymns, pray our prayers, share our fellowship, all while carrying the knowledge of what he'd done? How could we not see it?" The congregation sat in heavy silence. But the truth is, evil doesn't always announce itself. It doesn't always come with horns and pitchforks. Sometimes it comes with a kind smile and a firm handshake. Sometimes it volunteers for the church pancake breakfast. Sometimes it donates to the mission fund. This is perhaps the hardest lesson we must learn, that our ability to see goodness in others, while generally a virtue, can also make us vulnerable to those who would exploit that goodness. Monica Reeves sat in the 4th pew, listening and thinking about all the times she'd chatted with Thomas Brennan when buying supplies for school projects, how friendly he'd always been, how he'd never seemed anything but normal. The dissonance was overwhelming, her memory of those interactions versus the knowledge of what he'd done. But here's what I want us to remember. Thomas Brennan's evil does not diminish Ava Harris's goodness. His darkness does not extinguish her light. For 19 years, we have carried her memory, have tried to honor her legacy through our actions, through the way we teach our children, through the way we care for our neighbors. That doesn't change. She was real. Her impact was real. And justice, real justice, is finally coming.
After the service, people gathered in small groups in the parking lot, processing together, sharing memories and fears and frustrations. This was the hidden work of violent crime, not just the immediate damage, but the long-term erosion of trust, the way a community had to rebuild its sense of safety from the ground up. At Millbrook Elementary, Principal Karen Yamamoto called an emergency staff meeting. Teachers needed support, needed guidance on how to talk to students about what was happening, needed permission to express their own complicated feelings. "Many of our students have been asking questions," Principal Yamamoto said. "They've seen the news, they've heard their parents talking, and they're scared. They want to know if their teacher could be a bad person. They want to know if someone they trust could hurt them." Monica raised her hand. "What do we tell them?" "We tell them the truth, age appropriately. We tell them that sometimes people do bad things, but that doesn't mean all people are bad. We tell them that Ava would want them to continue believing in kindness, in goodness, in the beauty of learning and growing. We tell them that justice is being served, that the person who hurt Miss Harris is being held accountable. And we tell them that they are safe, that we will always do everything in our power to keep them safe." But even as she said it, Principal Yamamoto wondered if that was true. Could they promise safety? Could anyone? Thomas Brennan had seemed safe. He'd passed background checks, had no criminal record as an adult,
had been integrated into the community's trust infrastructure, and he'd been a murderer the whole time. The paranoia spread in subtle ways. Parents started asking more questions about volunteers. Background check requirements were tightened. Some people began looking at their neighbors differently, wondering what secrets might be hidden behind familiar faces. At Grace's coffee shop, owner Grace Mitchell, who'd run the business for 30 years, noticed the change in her customers. Conversations were more guarded. People sat alone more often. The easy camaraderie that had defined Millbrook's social spaces felt strained. "It's like everyone's wondering if the person next to them is hiding something terrible," she told Marcus when he stopped in for his usual morning coffee. "I've known most of these folks for decades, but now there's this suspicion. Like if we missed Thomas Brennan, what else are we missing?" Marcus understood. He'd seen it before in other cases, the way a single act of violence could ripple outward, creating waves of mistrust that took years to settle. The investigation continued, even with Brennan in custody. Marcus and his team combed through decades of Brennan's life, looking for other potential victims, other crimes that might have gone undetected. They reviewed unsolved cases from surrounding counties looking for patterns. They interviewed people who'd known Brennan in his youth, trying to understand the trajectory that had led from a sealed juvenile assault case to the murder of Ava Harris. What they found was chilling in its banality. Brennan had been, by most accounts, an average student, an average worker, an average husband. He'd shown no obvious signs of violence to those around him. His juvenile record, obtained through legal channels once he was charged with murder, revealed a 17-year-old who had assaulted a 15-year-old girl at a party, who'd been protected by his family's wealth and connections, who'd received counseling and probation instead of real consequences. "That's the first crack," criminal psychologist Dr. Lauren Simmons told Marcus during a consultation. She'd been brought in to help the prosecution build a profile. He learned at 17 that he could hurt someone and get away with it. That's a dangerous lesson for someone who may already have antisocial tendencies. It teaches them that consequences are negotiable, that the right circumstances can shield them from accountability. But then he went 40 years without another incident. At least, not one we've found. "That you found," Dr. Simmons emphasized. Sexual assault is one of the most underreported crimes. It's entirely possible there were other victims who never came forward, or who did but weren't believed, or whose cases never went anywhere. And even if there weren't other physical assaults, there may have been other behaviors: voyeurism, stalking, harassment. Predatory behavior often escalates gradually. The team put out a call through media channels. Anyone who'd had inappropriate interactions with Thomas Brennan over the years, anyone who'd felt uncomfortable but dismissed their instincts, anyone who'd witnessed concerning behavior should come forward. The tip line was set up with assurances of confidentiality. Within a week, they had 17 calls. Most were from people who, in retrospect, remembered moments that had seemed off, the way Brennan had stood too close to young women in his store, how his gaze lingered a bit too long, how he'd found excuses to touch customers' hands or arms. Nothing prosecutable, nothing that had risen to the level of reporting at the time, but a pattern nonetheless. 3 calls were more serious. A woman named Patricia Edwards, now 48, reported that she'd worked as a cashier at the hardware store in the summer of 1995 when she was 19. Brennan had made increasingly inappropriate comments about her appearance, had accidentally walked in on her changing in the break room twice, and had once cornered her in the supply closet and tried to kiss her. She'd quit and never reported it because she was young and scared and didn't think anyone would believe her. Another woman, Denise Cooper, reported that her teenage daughter had done a school project at the hardware store in 2003, an interview with a local business owner for a civics class. Brennan had been professional during the interview, but later that week, the daughter had
received strange phone calls late at night, heavy breathing, and silence. The calls stopped after 2 weeks, and they'd never been able to trace them, but Denise had always wondered. A third woman, who requested anonymity, said that she'd encountered Brennan on a walking trail in a park in neighboring Liberty County in 2001. He'd approached her, ostensibly to ask for directions, but had become increasingly aggressive when she'd tried to disengage. She'd run back to the parking lot where other people were present, and he'd left. She'd reported it to local police, but without a name or license plate number, there had been nothing to investigate. Each story by itself might have been dismissed. Together, they painted a picture of a man who'd tested boundaries, who'd sought opportunities to exert power over women, who'd been predatory in ways that had flown under the radar of official notice. "We can't charge him with any of these incidents," D.A. Cole said during a strategy meeting. "Statute of limitations, lack of corroborating evidence, not enough to meet the burden of proof. But we can use them to establish pattern and motive at trial, to show the jury that Ava Harris wasn't a random anomaly, but rather the culmination of decades of predatory behavior." The defense, predictably, filed motions to exclude all of it. Richard Caldwell argued that unsubstantiated allegations from decades ago were prejudicial, that they would poison the jury against his client without actually proving he'd committed the murder he was charged with. "Your Honor," Caldwell said during a pretrial hearing, "the state is trying to turn this into a referendum on my client's entire life, rather than a focused examination of whether he committed the specific crime alleged. These so-called pattern witnesses have come forward only after massive media coverage, only after my client's name has been dragged through the mud, only after there's a financial incentive to get involved in a high-profile case. Their testimony would be more prejudicial than probative." D.A. Cole countered, "Your Honor, in cases involving sexual violence, pattern evidence is crucial. It shows modus operandi. It shows motive. It shows a history of predatory behavior that makes the charged defense more understandable and more credible. The defense can cross-examine these witnesses, can challenge their credibility, but the jury deserves to hear the full context of who Thomas Brennan is and what he's capable of." Judge Harrington reserved ruling, saying he'd issue a decision closer to trial. But the legal maneuvering highlighted what the case was really about, not just whether Thomas Brennan had killed Ava Harris. The DNA evidence made that virtually certain, but what kind of story would be told about how and why. Meanwhile, Eleanor Harris navigated her own complex emotional landscape. She'd waited 19 years for this moment, but now that it had arrived, she felt oddly unmoored. The arrest hadn't brought Ava back. It hadn't filled the hole in her life. If anything, it had reopened wounds that had scarred over with time. She started having nightmares again, dreams where Ava called to her from dark woods, where she ran toward her daughter but could never quite reach her, where she woke gasping and sweating at 3 a.m. with tears on her face. Her therapist, Dr. Rebecca Walsh, whom she'd been seeing on and off for years, helped her process the resurgence of trauma. "You spent 19 years living with uncertainty. That uncertainty was painful. But it was also, in a way, stable. You'd learned to live with it, to build your life around it. Now that certainty has arrived, your whole system is adjusting. The grief is fresh again because the case is active again. This is normal, Eleanor. Painful, but normal." Eleanor attended every court hearing, sitting in the front row of the gallery, making sure Thomas Brennan had to see her face every time he entered the courtroom. She wanted him to remember what he'd taken. She wanted him to know that Ava's mother was watching, bearing witness, refusing to let him be forgotten or forgiven. After one hearing, she encountered Janet Brennan's sister, Melissa Crawford, in the courthouse bathroom. Melissa had been one of Eleanor's acquaintances, not close friends, but friendly enough.
They'd served together on the church hospitality committee years ago. The two women stood at adjacent sinks, washing their hands, avoiding eye contact in the mirror. Finally, Eleanor spoke. "I don't blame you, or Janet. You didn't know." Melissa turned to her, tears streaming down her face. "I keep thinking I should have known. I was her sister. How did I not see it? How did Janet not see it? We lived next door to them for 10 years. We had Sunday dinners together. I watched him be a normal person, a good husband, a decent man. And all that time, evil hides," Eleanor said quietly. "That's what makes it evil. If it announced itself, we could protect ourselves from it. But it disguises itself as normal, as kind, as trustworthy. You couldn't have known. Janet couldn't have known. None of us could have." Melissa wiped her eyes with a paper towel. "I keep thinking I should have known. I will day one of her good marriages. Part of me am grateful she never knew the truth, but another part feels like her whole life was a lie, and she deserved to know. I don't know which feeling is right." "Maybe both," Eleanor offered. "Maybe there's no right feeling about something this wrong." They stood there together, two women connected by the same man's violence in different ways, finding unexpected solidarity in shared horror. The preliminary hearing revealed more details that had been kept from the public. The prosecution presented its evidence: the DNA match, the crime scene photographs, the
The examiner's testimony about Ava's injuries, the timeline that placed Brennan within easy distance of the park during the window of death. The defense's cross-examination was aggressive, but ultimately ineffective against the scientific evidence. Caldwell tried to suggest contamination of the DNA sample, tried to question the chain of custody, tried to raise doubts about the testing methodology. But the evidence had been preserved meticulously, tested by 3 separate labs, verified by multiple experts. There was no reasonable doubt to be found in the science. What Caldwell did successfully was plant seeds about motive. "Where's the connection?" he asked during his cross-examination of Marcus. "My client had no personal relationship with Ms. Harris beyond casual business interactions. There's no evidence of stalking, no history of conflict, no financial motive, no romantic entanglement. The state is asking you to believe that a man with no criminal history as an adult, a respected business owner and community member, suddenly decided one night to commit a brutal murder for no apparent reason. Does that make sense, Detective? Your client's DNA was found beneath the victim's fingernails. He put it there. The reason why matters less than the fact that he did it. But it matters for context, doesn't it? For understanding. The state's theory is that this was a crime of opportunity, a random attack. But Mr. Brennan knew the victim would be running on that trail. How, exactly? Did he follow her? Did he wait for her specifically? Or are we to believe he just happened to be in the park at the same time and made a split-second decision to kill someone? Predators create opportunities, Marcus said. They position themselves in places where potential victims might be vulnerable. Your client lived half a mile from that park. He could have easily walked there, positioned himself on the trail, waited for someone to come along who was alone and vulnerable. Miss Harris happened to be that person. So your theory is that my client decided that particular night to become a murderer, that he walked to the park with the intention of killing whoever crossed his path, and that Miss Harris was simply unlucky? Yes, Marcus said simply. That's exactly what the evidence suggests. It was a chilling theory, made more chilling by its randomness. People wanted murders to make sense, to have clear motives and logical progressions. But sometimes violence was just violence, opportunistic, senseless, driven by impulses that normal people couldn't fathom. The judge ruled that there was sufficient probable cause for the case to proceed to trial. Thomas Brennan was bound over to Superior Court. The trial date was set for January 2025, 9 months away. Those 9 months became a strange liminal period for Millbrook.
The initial shock faded into a kind of sustained tension. Life continued. Businesses operated, schools held classes. People went to work and came home and made dinner and watched television, but everything felt slightly off, like a song played in the wrong key. The hardware store's building was eventually sold to a developer who planned to convert it into a cafe. The Brennan House on Magnolia Street was foreclosed on and purchased by a family relocating from Florida who didn't know its history and were horrified when neighbors told them its history. Support groups formed for people struggling with the revelation. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a local therapist, started offering free group sessions focused on processing collective trauma, on rebuilding trust, on learning to live with the knowledge that someone they'd known had been capable of such evil. At one session, Margaret Thornton, the woman who'd heard Ava's scream that night and assumed it was teenagers, spoke through tears. "I live with this every day. I heard her, and I did nothing. If I'd called 911, if I'd gone to check, maybe she'd still be alive. Maybe I could have saved her." "You couldn't have known," Dr. Mitchell said gently. "Parks have noise at night. People do fool around. You made the same assumption any of us would have made. The guilt you're carrying isn't yours to bear. It's his, only his." But guilt, Eleanor Harris had learned, didn't always distribute itself rationally. It settled where it could, in the hearts of people who'd done nothing wrong but who'd been adjacent to tragedy. As summer turned to fall and fall toward winter, Millbrook slowly began to recalibrate. The vigils at Ava's memorial bench became less frequent, but more intimate. Smaller groups gathering on the anniversary of her death, on her birthday, on random Tuesday evenings when someone needed to feel connected to her memory. The students she'd taught, now adults in their late 20s, created a scholarship fund in her name for aspiring teachers. They raised money through bake sales and 5K races and crowdfunding campaigns. The first Ava Harris Memorial Scholarship was awarded that December to a first-generation college student planning to major in early childhood education. Daniel Okoye returned to Millbrook for the scholarship ceremony, bringing his wife Rachel and their 2 children, a daughter named Sophie and a son named James. Eleanor met them at the community center where the ceremony was held, and something profound passed between the 2 women who'd both loved Ava in different ways.
Believe in goodness. I don't want Ava to be a secret or a source of shame. She was real. She mattered. They should know that. Rachel joined them, a warm presence who'd somehow made room in her marriage for her husband's history. "We have a photo of Ava in our home," she told Eleanor. "In the hallway, mixed in with other family pictures. Daniel talks about her the way you'd talk about anyone who shaped your life, with fondness, with sadness, but also with gratitude for the time you had." Eleanor felt something unlock in her chest, some fear she hadn't known she was carrying. She'd worried that Ava was becoming frozen in amber, a tragic figure rather than a real person who'd lived and loved and laughed. But here was Daniel, who'd built a new life while still honoring the old one, who'd found a way to let grief and joy coexist. "Thank you," Eleanor said to both of them. "Thank you for remembering her as she was." The scholarship recipient, a young woman named Jasmine Rodriguez, gave a speech about why she wanted to become a teacher. She talked about a kindergarten teacher she'd had who'd made her feel seen, who'd encouraged her love of reading, who'd believed in her potential. She didn't mention Ava by name. She'd been too young to have been in her class, but the echo was clear. Teachers rippled forward through time, their impact multiplying through the lives they touched. As Christmas approached, Millbrook decorated Main Street with lights and garland, tried to inject normalcy and joy into a year that had been marked by darkness. Grace's coffee shop played holiday music. The elementary school put on its annual winter concert. The church organized its toy drive for families in need. And Thomas Brennan sat in the county jail, awaiting trial,
while his defense team prepared their strategy, and his community tried to reconcile the man they'd thought they'd known with the monster he'd actually been. Marcus spent Christmas Eve alone, a choice he'd made years ago after the divorce. His daughter Emily was with her mother's family in Tennessee. He had a frozen dinner, a glass of scotch, and Ava's case file, which he reviewed one more time even though he'd memorized every detail. The crime scene photos, the witness statements, the evidence logs, the timeline, the DNA reports. Everything was in order. Everything pointed to Brennan. The case was as solid as cases got. But Marcus knew that trials were unpredictable. Juries were human, defense attorneys were skilled, and reasonable doubt was a powerful concept. He wouldn't feel at peace until a verdict came in, until 12 citizens said the words that would cement justice: guilty. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah Kimmons. "Merry Christmas, boss. Try not to work the whole night." He smiled and texted back, "No promises. Merry Christmas, Sarah." Outside, Millbrook was peaceful under a clear winter sky. Lights twinkled in windows. Families gathered around dinner tables. Children dreamed of presents under trees. The world turned, indifferent to human suffering and human hope alike. But in a week, the new year would begin. And in that new year, justice would be sought in a courtroom where 12 strangers would be asked to judge a man who'd hidden in plain sight for 19 years, who'd comforted family of the woman he'd murdered, who'd lived an ordinary life while carrying an extraordinary secret. Marcus closed the case file and raised his glass to Ava's photo, which he kept on his desk. A young woman frozen at 23, smiling at a camera, unaware that her death would consume 2 decades of investigation, would change the trajectory of dozens of lives, would force a community to confront the darkest possibilities of human nature. "Soon," he said to the photo. "Soon." This is a narrative spanning 75 years following the 2005 murder of Ava Harris, a 23-year-old kindergarten teacher in Millbrook, Georgia, and the profound legacy that emerged from tragedy. Ava Harris was killed on August 6, 2005, while running in Riverside Park. She was beaten to death with a rock, but managed to scratch her attacker, collecting his epithelial cells beneath her fingernails. Despite an extensive investigation led by Detective Marcus Webb, the case went cold for 19 years due to insufficient DNA technology. The crime devastated her community. Her fiancé, Daniel Okoye, mother, Eleanor Harris, and teaching colleagues like Monica Reeves struggled with unanswered questions and unresolved grief. Ava had been beloved, a passionate educator who saw potential in every child and created classrooms filled with wonder and hands-on learning. The breakthrough came in March 2024, when advanced DNA extraction methods finally yielded a genetic profile from the evidence. It matched Thomas William Brennan in CODIS, the FBI's DNA database. Brennan was a seemingly respectable 56-year-old hardware store owner who'd known Ava casually through her purchases for classroom supplies. Shockingly, he had joined the search party for Ava, attended her funeral, and comforted her family, all while knowing he had killed her. The investigation revealed Brennan's hidden history of predatory behavior towards women, including inappropriate conduct toward a teenage cashier and unsettling encounters that had never been formally reported. The evidence suggested a pattern of violence he'd successfully concealed beneath a facade of normalcy. The trial in January 2025 was Chatham County's most significant legal proceeding in years. Jury selection took 4 days due to widespread community awareness. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Raymond Cole, presented overwhelming DNA evidence, a match at 19 loci.
Genetic markers with probability of random occurrence at 1 in 5 trillion. Dr. Patricia Chen, the forensic analyst, testified with unshakable scientific certainty.
Defense attorney Richard Caldwell attempted to create reasonable doubt by questioning the chain of custody over 19 years and suggesting innocent explanations for the DNA transfer, but these arguments fell apart under scrutiny. The violence evident in Ava's broken fingernails indicated a desperate struggle, not casual contact. After 2 days of deliberation, the jury found Brennan guilty on all counts: malice murder, felony murder during aggravated assault, and concealing death. At sentencing on February 28, 2025, victim impact statements from Eleanor, Monica, and Daniel devastated the courtroom. Judge Harrington sentenced Brennan to life without parole, calling him an irredeemable danger to society who showed no remorse. But the narrative's power lies not in the conviction but in the transformation that followed. Eleanor Harris, rather than succumbing to bitterness, channeled her grief into purpose. The community refused to let Ava be defined solely by her murder. The Ava Harris School for Early Childhood Education opened in 2027, implementing her educational philosophy of hands-on learning, creativity, and seeing potential in every child. Monica Reeves became its first principal. The school expanded to 15 locations across multiple states, ultimately educating over 10,000 students annually and demonstrating measurably superior outcomes in both academic achievement and character development. In 2030, the Georgia State Legislature passed the Ava Harris Cold Case Technology Act, sponsored by Representative Christina Wallace, one of Ava's former kindergarten students. The act allocated significant funding for DNA testing of evidence and unsolved violent crimes. Over 75 years, it helped solve over 2,000 cases nationwide, as other states adopted similar legislation, bringing closure to thousands of families. Daniel Okoye rebuilt his life, remarrying and having children, while becoming Georgia's leading victims' rights advocate. His organization helped over 50,000 families navigate the criminal justice system, creating a comprehensive support model adopted across the country. Riverside Park was transformed into a memorial garden and eventually designated a national memorial site. The annual vigils evolved from grief-stricken gatherings into celebrations of justice, resilience, and community strength. The narrative follows the principles through natural deaths. Eleanor in 2038 at 91, having lived to see extensive impact. Marcus Webb in 2041 at 76, having kept his promise to solve the case. Monica Reeves in 2048 after writing an influential memoir on education through grief. Brennan died unmourned in prison in 2039. By the 75th anniversary in 2080, everyone who personally knew Ava had died, yet her influence persisted across generations. A great-great-grandniece named Ava, studying to become a teacher, spoke at the commemoration about how one life could ripple forward through time when a community transforms loss into purpose. The story ultimately argues that while evil cannot be prevented entirely, communities possess power to ensure it doesn't have the final word. Through education reform, legislative change, victims advocacy, and persistent commitment to memory and justice, Millbrook took 23 years of stolen life and multiplied them exponentially. Ava's legacy became measured not in how she died, but in how her death catalyzed decades of positive change. Schools built, cases solved, families supported, children educated in kindness and critical thinking. The narrative closes with Ava's memorial bench in darkness, holding space for a story that began in tragedy but transformed over 75 years into something resembling redemption, not for the perpetrator, but for a community that refused to let violence define them and instead created persistent, ever-expanding light. Don't miss out on fresh content delivered straight to you. Hit that subscribe button to stay updated with the latest videos, tips, and exclusive insights. By subscribing, you'll join our growing community and be the first to know when new content drops. It's completely free, and you can unsubscribe anytime. Your support means the world and helps us create even better content for you. Click subscribe now, and let's grow together on this exciting journey.